All right, here we go. October 21st, 2015. It's a date that fans of the Back to the Future trilogy have been waiting for. This is the day, in part two. Remember,
for generations, audiences have celebrated Back to the Future as a masterpiece of entertainment, a film so perfectly crafted that it seems almost inevitable, as if the version we know was always destined to reach theaters in exactly this form. We remember the gleaming DeLorean, the iconic clock tower, and Michael J. Fox's infectious charm carrying us through a story about friendship, family, and the possibility of changing the future. What most viewers never knew was that nearly everything about this beloved film was different from what the filmmakers originally envisioned. The story that was buried beneath layer after layer of studio notes, creative pressure, and practical necessity tells a far more unsettling tale than the adventure we came to love. It is a version of Back to the Future that was deliberately erased, and understanding why that erasure happened reveals something profound about how stories evolve in the collision between artistic vision and commercial reality. The journey toward making Back to the Future began in 1984 when screenwriter Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale were developing what they believed would be a science fiction film for a more adult audience. Their original screenplay carried the weight of its era, a document created during the height of Cold War anxiety, when nuclear war felt like an imminent threat rather than a distant possibility. The opening pages of that early draft reveal a fundamentally different tone from what eventually reached cinemas. This was not a comfortable, heartwarming adventure. Instead, Zemeckis and Gale had crafted something paranoid and claustrophobic, a story that took seriously the existential dread that permeated American culture during the 1980s. The script presented time travel not as a whimsical opportunity, but as a desperate gamble for survival in a world perpetually balanced on the edge of destruction. The most striking difference between the original vision and the finished film involved the climactic sequence. In early drafts, Marty McFly's journey home did not culminate in the romantic imagery of a lightning strike at the clock tower. Instead, the script called for the climax to take place in the Nevada desert, where Marty would position himself near an actual nuclear weapons test. His plan was to harness the raw energy of a nuclear explosion, one of humanity's most terrifying achievements, to power his return to 1985. It was a scene designed to be genuinely frightening, combining the personal stakes of a teenager desperate to get home with the backdrop of nuclear holocaust. The filmmakers were asking audiences to feel the same terror that defined the era when the script was written, to sit with the possibility that even our protagonists might not survive in a world where nuclear annihilation was a credible threat. This was not entertainment designed to make audiences feel safe. It was deliberately constructed to make them feel the weight of their own historical moment. When Zemeckis and Gale began shopping this script around Hollywood in the early 1980s, the reaction was remarkably consistent: rejection. More than 40 studios passed on the project, and their reasons revealed something about how the entertainment industry understands audience expectations. Studio executives found the script too strange, too difficult to categorize, and ultimately too risky to invest in. It was neither explicitly an adult comedy nor a straightforward family film. The science fiction elements felt too heavy, and the emotional tone seemed unpredictable. Disney, when offered the opportunity to finance the project, specifically objected to certain elements of the screenplay, particularly the troubling subplot involving Marty and his mother. The studio decided that audiences were not prepared for the uncomfortable emotional territory the script was asking them to explore. As rejection after rejection accumulated, it became increasingly clear that Hollywood had no appetite for this particular vision of a time travel story. The breakthrough came in 1984, when Robert Zemeckis achieved mainstream success with Romancing the Stone, suddenly making him a bankable director. Universal Pictures, recognizing the commercial potential of having a hot director attached to any project, agreed to greenlight the time travel story. However, the Hollywood system works through negotiation and compromise, and the script that Universal agreed to finance was substantially different from what Zemeckis and Gale had originally written. By the time cameras began rolling, numerous elements had been modified to make the story more commercially appealing. The tone had been lightened considerably. The Cold War paranoia remained in traces, but was no longer the central nervous system of the narrative. Most importantly, the nuclear ending had been abandoned entirely, replaced with something more visually spectacular, but tonally different: the lightning strike that would become one of cinema's most iconic moments. Among the significant changes was the decision to replace the original mechanical-looking time machine with a DeLorean sports car. The original concept had the machine resembling an industrial refrigerator, cold and clinical, something that belonged in a laboratory rather than adventure film. The DeLorean provided style, sleekness, and the kind of visual appeal that studio marketing departments could immediately understand and sell. It transformed the time machine from a threatening apparatus into something iconic and aspirational. This seemingly practical design decision actually represented a fundamental shift in how the story was being told, moving away from science fiction that engaged with real fears towards science fiction that offered escapism and wonder. The question of casting proved even more consequential to the film's eventual tone. The filmmaker's first choice for Marty McFly was Michael J. Fox, the charismatic young star of the television series Family Ties. However, Fox's television schedule made him unavailable, and the production team turned to Eric Stoltz, an actor of genuine talent who had recently received critical acclaim for his work in Mask. Stoltz began filming in the role, and initially, everything seemed to be progressing normally. Yet within a few weeks, a problem became impossible to ignore. Stoltz was approaching the character with the same emotional intensity and seriousness he had brought to his previous dramatic work. His portrayal of Marty was introspective and weighted with genuine anxiety, a performance that captured the spirit of the darker original screenplay but actively fought against the lighter, more comedic direction the production was now taking. Scenes that were meant to be humorous fell flat under the weight of Stoltz's intensity. The adventure was being suffocated by the seriousness of the performance. Replacing a lead actor after several weeks of filming was nearly unprecedented in Hollywood filmmaking. It would require reshooting significant portions of the film, duplicating expenses, and reorganizing a complex production schedule. Yet the filmmakers made the extraordinarily difficult decision to replace Stoltz anyway, bringing in Michael J. Fox and renegotiating his television commitments so he could work nights and weekends on the film. This decision was not made out of personal dislike for Stoltz, who was a perfectly competent actor. Rather, it reflected a recognition that the performance style required to bring the revised, lighter version of the screenplay to life demanded a different kind of actor, someone who could bring warmth, charm, and natural comedic timing to scenes that the original script had never intended to be particularly funny. The subplot involving Marty and his mother, Lorraine, illustrated another crucial area where the filmmakers had to navigate between the original vision and commercial viability. In the early drafts, this storyline occupied a far more uncomfortable space. Audiences were meant to feel genuine unease as they watched a teenage girl develop romantic feelings for a boy she does not realize is her own son from a future. The original script did not soften this discomfort with humor or warmth. Instead, it asked audiences to sit with the psychological strangeness of the situation. However, studio executives recognized that this emotional territory was too disturbing for mainstream audiences. The solution was to wrap the subplot in enough comedy and lightheartedness that audiences could experience the discomfort without being overwhelmed by it. The finished film maintains the subplot, but reframes it as a source of awkward humor rather than genuine psychological disturbance. The story of Crispin Glover and his likeness in Back to the Future Part 2 represented a different kind of erasure entirely. After George McFly became beloved by audiences, Glover was expected to reprise the role in the sequel. However, negotiations broke down over salary and other creative disagreements, and Glover did not appear in the film. Rather than recasting the role with a different actor, the filmmakers made a controversial decision. They hired Jeffrey Weissman and used prosthetic makeup designed to replicate Glover's facial features as closely as possible. When Glover discovered that his face had been recreated without his consent, he pursued legal action. The lawsuit raised profound questions about the ownership of human appearance and the rights of actors regarding their likenesses. The case was eventually settled, and the Screen Actors Guild established new rules to prevent similar situations. However, Glover's fight represented an early warning about the troubling implications of digital recreation technologies that would become increasingly significant decades later. The production of the trilogy was marked by genuine danger that was never fully disclosed to the public. During the filming of the hanging scene in Back to the Future Part 3, something went catastrophically wrong. Michael J. Fox performed the scene himself, and the rope tightened in a way that was never supposed to occur. His hand slipped from the protective position, and he lost consciousness. The crew eventually freed him, but he had been unconscious long enough to frighten everyone present. This was not a theatrical moment of peril designed for the camera. It was a genuine life-threatening accident that occurred on set, later covered up or minimized in the publicity surrounding the film's release. The finished films carried visible evidence of the chaos and pressure that characterized their production. Careful viewers noticed continuity errors, imperfections that editing could not completely resolve, and anachronisms in period details. The clock tower flyer changes between scenes in ways that defy logical explanation within the story's internal universe. Background extras repeat in locations they could not logically be. The plutonium power source behaves inconsistently, with no clear rules governing how much is needed or what it actually does. These were not sophisticated errors that required extensive film knowledge to spot. They were obvious inconsistencies to anyone paying attention. Yet the studio released the film anyway, suggesting that the pressure and chaos of production had left visible marks that could not be fully erased. Understanding why the studio made all these changes requires examining not just commercial calculation, but something deeper about what audiences need from stories. The original darker version, filled with Cold War anxiety and nuclear dread, offered no comfort. It asked audiences to sit with fear and uncertainty without providing the reassurance that everything would work out. However, the revised version contained a message that proved far more powerful and ultimately more timeless. At its core, the story presented the idea that the past is not immutable, that the mistakes of previous generations can be repaired, that people deserve second chances, and that the future remains unwritten and full of possibility. This was an extraordinarily hopeful message, particularly powerful for young audiences struggling with the anxiety of their own times. The darker original version could never have delivered this message because it was too preoccupied with showing that the world was genuinely dangerous and that survival itself was uncertain. The revised version, by contrast, suggested that intelligence, friendship, and determination could overcome obstacles, that families could heal, and that love could transcend time itself. This shift in emphasis did not happen cynically or through simple studio interference. Rather, as the creative team worked through the pressures of actual production, they discovered that the story itself kept pushing toward hope, toward warmth, toward the belief that things could get better. The version of Back to the Future that audiences never saw remains partially visible to anyone willing to look carefully. It emerges in fragments of surviving Eric Stoltz footage, in the possible presence of his hand in a punch scene that was never officially addressed, in continuity errors scattered through the finished film, like geological fault lines, revealing the layers beneath the surface. The erased version left its fingerprints everywhere, not as failure, but as evidence of a creative process far more complicated and human than the seamless final product suggests. The film that became beloved was not inevitable. It was forged through compromise, accident, pressure, and ultimately the discovery that the story wanted to tell a message of hope more than it wanted to explore despair. Understanding this history does not diminish the finished film. Instead, it deepens our appreciation for how great stories emerge not from perfect planning, but from the sometimes chaotic collision between vision and reality, between artistic ambition and the practical demands of creation itself.